Welcome to Pandemic Preparedness here at Biodefense.com. I'm your host, Mike Adams, the Health Ranger. And every day something new keeps happening in this that requires me to post another episode here to update you. I'm recording this on the day that it was confirmed a nurse in the Dallas hospital has Ebola, contracted it from Mr. Thomas Duncan, the first Ebola victim in America, patient 0. And there are some really important considerations to understand about what happened. But first, let me just tell you that this episode is about isolation at home. Yes, finally, the episode that I promised you many episodes ago is here. I'm going to talk about how to isolate yourself or a family member or someone that you might be giving safe harbor to in your own home, assuming that they have Ebola or that they might have Ebola, and you want to protect the rest of your family members or yourself from that person while also providing care for that person. We'll talk about that scenario here in this episode. And you may wonder, well, wait a minute, why can't they just go to the hospital? Well, the hospitals are going to be closed down, folks. The emergency room of the Dallas Presbyterian Hospital is already closed. They closed it today the minute they learned that a nurse there contracted Ebola from a patient. And now, let me cover this first. There's so many important things to understand. Number one, we were told by the CDC and the White House that Ebola would not spread in America. And then we were told that the reason for that is because we have the best hospitals in the world. Well, Ebola just spread in the best hospital in the world. You know, a first world hospital in Dallas, Texas, a modern day, high-tech, high-cost hospital. It's not some ghetto hospital there that this guy was in. This is a mainstream, high-tech, advanced medicine hospital, and it spread there. We're also told that the CDC recommendations for protective gear are perfectly adequate, that the medical staff is fully trained, that the hospital has all the capabilities that it needs to care for this patient. Don't worry, there's no risk, nothing's going to happen that's bad. You know, go home and eat your Fruit Loops or whatever you're munching on. So it turns out that, of course, Ebola was caught by a healthcare worker who was wearing protective gear. She was wearing the CDC recommended protective gear. She was following the protocols. She had the training. She was in the isolation room. She was caring for Mr. Duncan, the patient 0. And yet she caught it anyway. Now, if you go back to some of the earlier episodes of this course, Pandemic Preparedness, you'll remember me warning about this happening in America. I gave this warning over and over and over again. I said, you need to have level 4 biohazard equipment to be around patients who have Ebola. You can't slap on a pair of gloves and an N95 mask and a pair of goggles and waltz into this guy's room, which is totally contaminated with Ebola, because all it takes is 4 or 5 little microscopic particles of Ebola. All it takes is those getting on your skin and into a scrape or a cut or a scratch, or getting them on your fingers and then touching the corner of your eye to scratch your eye or scratch your nose, or just touching the corner of your mouth. That's all it takes, and then you're infected. And in fact, as I've been warning all along, Ebola can contaminate surfaces. And then if someone touches that surface, they can be infected from that surface. Now, the CDC, to this very day, continues to insist that Ebola can only be caught through, quote, direct contact with the body fluids of an Ebola patient. Direct contact. Now, to most people, that means you have to be touching the patient in order to catch Ebola. But that's not true. It's a big lie. And I've called out the CDC on this lie over and over and over again, tried to warn people, even tried to warn medical staff, that this can be caught indirectly. The Ebola patient can touch a surface, that surface is contaminated, and then if you come along and touch that surface, you can now be infected with Ebola. So how is this playing out in the Dallas hospitals? Well, what we think is happening right now is that the nurse, the health worker, a woman who was infected and confirmed today as having Ebola, that she may have contaminated the surface of her protective gear with Ebola, and then she infected herself as she was removing the gear. In other words, if you get Ebola on your gloves, but then you're taking off your gloves in a way that you touch the outside of the glove with your bare finger, and then you use that finger to scratch the corner of your eye, then boom, you're infected. So that is what's called an indirect transmission of Ebola. And that is almost certainly what has happened in the Dallas hospital. And what it means is that until the CDC tells the truth, until people are properly trained and have the proper equipment, which should be level 4 biohazard positive pressure spacesuits, essentially, that until that happens, we're going to see more and more infections of doctors and nurses and healthcare workers because they aren't being given the proper gear, they aren't being given the proper training, and frankly, these hospitals don't have the proper isolation rooms. I guarantee you that the room where Mr. Duncan was being kept at this Dallas Presbyterian Hospital, this was not a level 4 biohazard containment room. I know that as a fact. In fact, there is no such room in that hospital. There are rooms like that at Emory and Nebraska and the U.S. Army virology research centers, places like that, but there's only a handful of these places across the entire country of the United States. And if there is an Ebola outbreak and you try to take patients to those centers, they're going to be overrun in no time. There might only be a couple dozen beds in the entire country that are level 4 biohazard isolation rooms. Everything else runs the risk of causing infections, of spreading the disease, which is exactly what just happened in Dallas, Texas, as of this morning, which is October 12th, 2014. So now all these claims that we've heard that it's not going to spread, it's not going to be in America, there's nothing to worry about. I've even heard people trying to downplay this and say, well, it's hard to catch, they say. It's really hard to catch. Well, if it's hard to catch, then how did this healthcare worker get it when she was wearing all the isolation gear? If it's hard to catch, how did Dr. Brantley get it? When he's a medical doctor, properly trained in isolation, wearing protective gear, how did he get it? How did all these other doctors and nurses in Africa get it if it's hard to catch? Why is it doubling the number of infected patients every 3 to 4 weeks if it's hard to catch? Clearly it's not hard to catch. It's pretty dang easy to catch. It's easy to catch. That's why it's spreading so effectively. If it were hard to catch, it wouldn't be an outbreak. It would have already been contained long ago. So these people who are just trying to downplay the scenario are acting very irresponsibly and potentially even putting other people's lives at risk by not acknowledging the severity of the routes of transmission for Ebola. And this has been my main concern from the very beginning, that we have to take this seriously. Ebola is a level 4 biohazard. And that means that you need to have a positive pressure suit, or at minimum a full face respirator with a complete body suit. Every gap in the suit has to be taped up. You have to completely decontaminate the suit before you take it off. And you'd really be better off in a positive pressure suit, like a space suit, with a connected air hose that inflates the suit. And even then, you're going to need multiple layers of gloves inside the suit, just in case you cut one layer, or there's a tear in the suit, or there's a needle jab that punctures the suit, which is a very common occurrence in these biohazard labs. There are all kinds of conditions like that. That's why it's a positive pressure suit. So if you jab it with a needle, the positive air pressure blows the air out the hole, and you don't actually get air coming into the hole and infecting you. So until we do this, I don't think we're going to be very successful containing Ebola in any country. I think it's going to continue to spread until we treat it with the level of seriousness that it calls for. And I know there must be active and also retired virologists who worked for the U.S. military, maybe U.S. Army, Fort Detrick researchers, who perhaps were even involved in the Reston outbreak back in the 1990s. There was Ebola Reston that experienced an outbreak and infected many scientists at that time, but they were able to contain it. They treated Ebola at that time as if it were a very dangerous level 4 biohazard, and that's why they were able to contain it. They went into that monkey house and they brought out literally tons of dead monkeys, hundreds of them, I think over 500 dead monkeys, and they incinerated them because that was the only way that they could be sure that they would be able to destroy the Ebola virus and to make sure that it remained destroyed. And then they went in, they had to scrub down the whole place with bleach and ultraviolet light and all kinds of treatments. And even after that, nobody would rent it. So I think the building remained abandoned for a very long time. It may still be abandoned today. That's the place where the outbreak happened in the 1990s. And now then, today, all of a sudden, you've got these people in the media that are saying, well, it's no big deal. It's hard to catch. Yeah, all you need is a mask and a pair of gloves and a pair of goggles and you're good, you know. And then you've got these people in Dallas walking in and out of Duncan's apartment, wearing no gear whatsoever, no gloves, no mask, nothing. And acting like they're authorities who know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. They're fools. And they're fools who may pay for that foolishness with their own lives if they get infected. So I just want to be perfectly clear that Ebola is a level 4 biohazard. And I know our government can water down all the other news out there. They can say, oh, the national debt, it doesn't matter. You know, the unemployment rate, don't worry about it. It's only 5.9%, they'll say. You know, everything's fine. Don't worry about these things. But when they try that with Ebola, believe me when I say the Ebola virus itself doesn't care about the spin and the propaganda. The Ebola virus doesn't care how expensive your healthcare system is. It doesn't care how advanced your hospital technology is. It doesn't care about your skin color. The Ebola virus is going to infect people and spread simply because it can. And it doesn't listen to spin or propaganda or denials. It simply infects and replicates. That's all it does. And it's damn good at it. And if you don't take that threat seriously, if you don't respect the ability of the virus to spread and replicate, then you can be destroyed by it. And that's my warning for America, a warning which fortunately is beginning to be heeded by more and more people out there as this unfolds. Now let's get into the isolation strategies for your own home, as I promised for this section. The likely scenarios that we're going to run into here in the middle of an outbreak is that you will be quarantined in your own home. I talked about this in the last chapter. The hospitals obviously will be completely overrun. There won't be beds available. They'll be shut down. People who are sick or symptomatic will be told to go home. People will be told to shelter in place, stay in your own homes. Under medical martial law, there will be martial law declared in a sufficiently large outbreak. That could be declared for one city or an entire state or even an entire nation. Once that is declared, you're going to have to be in your house. And I've already talked about the need to have extra supplies, food, water, communications, emergency medicine, some currency, something that you can barter with, something for self-defense, all of these basic needs, personal hygiene needs, for example. So I'm not going to repeat all that here. But now let's talk about the scenario where you are quarantined in your own home, but then a family member or a friend is symptomatic. Maybe that person showed up at your house and they're asking for help, or possibly that person already lived there. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe it's you, and you need to isolate yourself, but then teach your family how to care for you while they protect themselves. So let's talk about that. And this is why it's so good that we had that discussion at the first 10 minutes of this chapter, because now you know that Ebola can contaminate surfaces. So what you are going to have to do is you're going to have to build, as best you can, a clean room environment in your own home, which is not easy to do. But I'm going to give you some advice and some instruction here. I can't warranty this information. It's being offered for free anyway, but use it as best you can, and understand that I can't guarantee that this will offer you 100% protection. But here's the strategy behind it. Number one, let's assume that you're going to isolate a family member in a bedroom. And let's just pick a standard bedroom size of 10 by 10 feet or 10 by 12 or 10 by 14, whatever. I'll just say 10 by 10. What you need to do, first of all, is you need to get that person into that room, and then you need to seal off that room from the rest of the house. You're going to need a very large amount of plastic sheeting in order to be able to do this. Now, this plastic sheeting is a non-permeable surface. The virus can't drill its way through the plastic sheeting. So this is a good barrier. So get that person into that room and put up some plastic sheeting inside the room where you have a sheet hanging down covering the doorway, and then you need to have another layer of a sheet on the outside. So if you open the doors normally open inward towards inside the bedroom. You want to have a plastic sheet covering the outside of that, and then another plastic sheet covering the inside of that. Anytime someone enters this room, they need to be wearing the best protective gear that you have available. In other words, they need to have a full Tyvek bodysuit with a hood, a full face respirator, a couple layers of latex gloves, the booties on their shoes, the covers, shoe covers. They need to have taped up all the joints where, let's say, the Tyvek suit, where it meets the gloves, that needs to be taped up with actual, like packing tape, for example, so that there are no gaps. Where the full face respirator meets the hood, you need to tape that up. If you're wearing a bodysuit that has any kind of a zipper or a collar or any kind of opening of any kind, those need to be completely taped shut. This is the way virologists do it. Now, ideally, you would have a spacesuit with an air hose, and you'd be able to walk around there in a level 4 biohazard suit. But I don't think very many people's homes are set up for that. I kind of doubt it. So do the best you can with what you have. Obviously, when you enter that room, you must consider that every surface in that room is infected with Ebola. The walls, the floor, the drinking cup, the dishes, if you're giving that person some food and then taking the dishes back out of there, the dishes have to be considered to be contaminated. Everything in that room must be considered to be contaminated, including the walls and the ceiling. And I'll talk about ventilation here in just a minute. Now, ideally, if you had the ability to do this in advance, you could cover the walls and the ceiling with plastic to create impermeable surfaces so that Ebola would not stand a chance of sort of thriving in the texture of the wall or the texture of the ceiling or the texture of the carpet, for example. Cover all the surfaces you can with plastic. You have to make it as sterile as possible, or I should say, make it so that the Ebola virus can't stick to it and be harbored there. But you must assume that every surface is contaminated. You must assume that the patient, the family member, is contaminated, that everything they're wearing is contaminated, their clothing is contaminated, the bed sheets are contaminated. Everything in that room must be thought of as contaminated and potentially deadly. So if you then take something out of that room, you need to have a protocol, a process in place for how to deal with those things. Now, I'm going to give you some basic advice on that, but again, I can't guarantee 100% effectiveness of this. You obviously don't have a level 4 biohazard facility in your home. None of us do. So you do the best you can with what you have. But a couple of things that kill Ebola are sunlight and bleach. So one of the things that you should establish is anytime you go into this room to provide, let's say, food or water to this person, you are going to emerge from that room with contaminated objects. A really good strategy to follow from there would be to immediately go to an outside location where you remain in your bodysuit carrying the objects that you removed from that room, and then you are then washed down and scrubbed down in sunlight with water and bleach. If you do this, the bleach will, of course, kill the viruses, and the sunlight will also tend to kill those viruses at the same time. So this is a very good safety precaution. Just be careful, though. Whoever is spraying you down, they could get contaminated if there's a splash effect. So you don't want someone standing close to you, spraying you with a hose, and then possibly having Ebola virus become aerosolized to where they could catch it. So ideally, that person needs to be wearing some sort of protective gear as well, such as a full face respirator. In fact, an entire bodysuit would be ideal. You really want to have one person who's wearing the full gear, scrubbing down the other person who just came out of the room. And even after that, Once you get out of your bodysuit, you probably want to continue to hose off and maybe stand naked in the sunlight for a little while. I know this isn't the normal type of thing that people do in your neighborhood, but Ebola will change everything if an outbreak actually takes place. Now let's talk about ventilation. For most bedrooms, there is air cycling through the room anytime your ventilation system is on. If you've got air conditioning or heating or just the fan running for, let's say, a centralized air system, you're normally blowing air into that room through a vent. Well, because the room can't contain an infinite amount of air, there's also air leaving the room at the same time that a lot of homeowners aren't really aware of. Every cubic foot of air, let's say, that enters the room through the vent has to be displaced by a cubic foot of air that's leaving the room. That normally leaves under the door. There's a gap under the door to the room that might be half an inch thick or an inch thick even on some doors. And this air is leaving the room under that door. Now, this can be a source of Ebola contamination via aerosolized particles. So it's crucial to understand where that door is, the stream of air coming out of it, and what might be contaminated there, because you don't obviously want to be thinking that it's safe to walk by that room barefoot. And you might pick up Ebola particles on your feet if you did that. So really you want to trace the path from that bedroom under the door back to the air exchange unit in your house, which sometimes is in a closet in the hallway. So slowly the air will circulate in your house in this manner, and potentially it will contaminate every surface in your hallway all the way down to the air exchange unit. Now, some people may choose to have an air exchange filter that can filter out very, very small particles, such as a HEPA filter. Now, a HEPA filter does filter out very, very small particles. Whether it filters out Ebola is an entirely different question. I know some of these filters get pretty small, down to just a few microns, but I wouldn't trust them to filter out Ebola unless it was certified for doing so, and I don't think there is any air filter that's actually certified for doing so. At the same time, I think it's a great idea to consider having a HEPA air filtration unit in this isolation room. And my favorite unit is the IQ Air unit. They're just called IQ Air. They make hospital grade units, but you don't need a hospital grade unit. Just every unit they sell is HEPA certified. If you run that on high in the room, it will tend to capture all the particles in the room on which Ebola may be riding. So although that filter doesn't necessarily filter out the Ebola viral particle itself, which is very, very small, it will tend to trap and thereby filter out the particles upon which Ebola may be riding or clinging. So this is a great idea to have in the room. The other thing that's a great idea is to consider having an off-the-shelf ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light kills viruses. This is why sunlight is able to destroy Ebola and other viral strains. In fact, virtually every virus is killed by sunlight. Now, off-the-shelf ultraviolet light units, you shouldn't stare at them directly, although they're not that harmful at the low intensity that they're purchased at these days. There's a lot of questions about whether the intensity of the light is enough to make any real difference. I don't know the answer to that yet, but as a sort of low-cost, off-the-shelf solution to put in that room and just run 24/7 along with the air filter, it surely can't hurt. It absolutely can't hurt. It's cheap, it's low cost, it's relatively safe, and in the worst case, it may be useless, but in the best case, it may kill some of the Ebola viruses that are contaminating the room. Now, I have covered the Xenex robot that kills Ebola in about 2 minutes, and it's used in hospitals. It's in about 250 hospitals around the country right now, and I spoke with a spokesperson at Xenex who explained that this has 25,000 times the intensity of natural sunlight in terms of a specific wavelength of ultraviolet light called UVC. And UVC is very, very lethal to viruses. So the problem is this robot is $100,000 base price. So it's not something that everyday people are going to get. But you can sort of have the low-tech, low-cost version of that by buying some black lights, which are ultraviolet lights, and setting those up in the room. I've actually seen naturopathic clinics use those in the past just to kind of kill some of the airborne pathogens that might be cruising around the clinic. Again, I don't know how effective they are, but it surely can't hurt. All right, now we've got to talk about a little gross part here, the feces and urine of the person in the isolation room are both potentially contaminated with Ebola and very infectious. Now, you might think, well, I'll just let this person march down the hall and use the bathroom. If so, that bathroom is now entirely contaminated, and no one else could be allowed to use that bathroom. So ideally, you would choose a quarantine room that has its own bathroom, and then you wouldn't have to carry feces and urine out of the room for them. But if they don't have their own bathroom in that room, you can't let them use the public bathroom. In other words, the common bathroom in the house, because that would put everybody else at risk. So you're going to have to bring them, a bedpan. You're going to have to take care of those excretions for them and treat those as if they are contaminated. So this is not obviously going to be a very fun job for anyone to do, but it's also a potentially dangerous job, because you then have to transfer these liquids into the toilet and flush the toilet. Now, the way the U.S. Army handles this is they would simply pour bleach down the drain at the same time that they're pouring potentially contaminated fluids down the drain. So you might pour the bedpan fluids into the toilet, follow it up with a lot of bleach, and then flush it down. It'll be interesting to find out what the government authorities say you're supposed to do with this, because it's not entirely clear that the water treatment facilities are going to eliminate Ebola. Probably they will, but I haven't seen any report on that to confirm it. But you've got an even bigger problem in all of this, is that the simple act of pouring this into the toilet has potentially contaminated that toilet. So ideally, you would pick a bathroom that you only use for this purpose, and you would make sure that you only enter that bathroom while wearing your hazmat gear, which you should have been wearing in the first place when you were picking this up from the isolation room. The bad scenario that you have to avoid is using a common household toilet for this function and then failing to clean the surfaces of that toilet. Then someone else in your family comes along and uses the toilet, sits on the toilet seat, and then they become infected, which is not very difficult for that to happen. So how would you scrub down a toilet? You would have to intensely scrub it with a bleach solution. Every single surface of that toilet, every time you pour a contaminated fluid down that toilet. This is not an easy job. This requires real dedication if you want to stay safe. So I hope you're beginning to really see that caring for an Ebola patient in your own home is a very big deal. And I think that most Americans would really struggle with this process. I don't think that people follow instructions very well. I mean, I remember the CDC having a poster out there that was just trying to teach people to wash their hands. And they found that it was so confusing just to teach someone how to wash their hands that they had to come up with a shortcut trick. And the way they did this was they would encourage people to wash their hands while singing the happy birthday song to themselves. And then by the time they finished singing the song, then they were finished washing their hands. This was designed to create a duration of hand washing necessary to really clean the hands. So you can imagine, in a nation where people have to be told to sing happy birthday to yourself to wash your hands, how on earth are you going to teach people how to build isolation rooms, how to handle basically level 4 biohazard type of processes of decontamination, of removing objects from the room, decontaminating those, eliminating, body fluids, understanding airflows in and out of the room. This is basically impossible to teach our population. But it's not impossible to teach a smart person, such as yourself, listening to this, which is why I'm sharing this, because many, many people, of course, are very capable of this. And those who are able to understand this and put it into practice have a much greater chance of survival in an actual outbreak. But don't expect your neighbor to be doing this correctly, all right? Don't expect the masses to be able to figure this out. The masses are not that good at figuring things out. They have a hard time making their own meals. Everything's microwavable today. Pop it in, push a button, there's your food. So trying to get these people to practice some resemblance of a level 4 biohazard process might be asking too much. And I'm not saying that everybody's going to be able to handle that. Now, once you have all this down, what kind of supportive care should you give this person? Well, consider the fact that they may be symptomatic, but they may not have Ebola. There are a lot of false positives out there where people check themselves into a hospital, they've got a fever. And it turns out they just have a stomach bug or a flu or something like that. Maybe they even have malaria or the chikungunya virus that's spreading out there, or this, what is this, ED68, I think it's called, this enterovirus that children are getting. Maybe they have something like that and they don't have Ebola, but you don't know for about 21 days for sure. So consider that isolation is going to take place for about 21 days. And during this time, you're going to have to give this person supportive care, which from a medical perspective simply means giving them sufficient water, controlling the temperature of the room for them to make it comfortable, allowing them to get sleep, and also giving them the kind of food or superfoods or nutritional supplements that they need to support healthy immune responses to an Ebola pandemic. And listen to episode 6 of this course if you want specific recommendations on those so-called natural supplements or natural treatments that may be very useful. I've mentioned quite a few, like black elderberry extract. I've mentioned antiviral supplements such as peppermint or garlic, ginger. There's so many of them out there that have antiviral properties. You can even make antiviral meals. I've mentioned the importance of vitamin D, and I've even mentioned the importance of somebody experimenting with colloidal silver. Even though there's no evidence that colloidal silver can block Ebola, it's one of those things that it may have potential, and if you're dying, what's the harm in trying it? There's no harm in trying it for 21 days. You're not going to turn blue in 21 days by chugging some colloidal silver, and it just might help. I mean, after all, you've been sent home to die by the hospital. It's not like they're taking care of you. You're kind of on your own, so you better pull out all the stops and figure out all the solutions that can help keep you alive. So provide this person with as much as you can and as much as they can tolerate, but don't force them into things that they don't want to eat or drink. You don't want to treat them like a prisoner in your own home. You need to treat them like a guest. And if they just don't want to take any more black elderberry extract, even though it tastes pretty good, then you need to respect that decision. Give them what they want. Maybe they want a cheeseburger. See if you can get them a cheeseburger. Sometimes being able to help their mental state and their emotional state is just as important as being able to help them physically and medically. Make sure they have good, clean water. Make sure they have lots of electrolytes. Make sure they have sufficient nutritional supplementation, including vitamin C, vitamin D, all the B vitamins, and possibly other antiviral plants, whatever you can scrounge up. But don't neglect the mental health aspects of this. I don't know if you've ever been locked in a room for 21 days, but it drives a lot of people nuts. I don't think I would like to be locked in a room for 21 days, even if it were in my own room. That would not be a good feeling. So you have to think about this person, probably somewhere around day 3, 4, or 5, unless they're, in a coma or crashing, bleeding out or something, they're probably going to want to get out of that room. And what's going to happen in this case is bargaining. So be prepared for the bargaining. You're going to hear this person say things like, "I'm not sick. If I were sick, I would have had it by now, so you need to let me out. I got to get out of here. I'm going crazy in here." Part of your job in the interest of public safety and the safety of your family and yourself, is to keep this person in that quarantine for a full 21 days. How you do that is going to be up to you and your capabilities and how that person is behaving and so on, but don't count on outside help, and try to avoid violence. Try to avoid forcing people to do what they don't want to do. You don't want to make this person crazy angry. They may just open a window and jump out the window. And then you got an Ebola patient possibly running around the neighborhood. Not what you wanted to accomplish. So do what you can to keep them calm. Maybe you need to talk with them, spend some time in there with them, assure them that this is the right thing to do, that if they are symptom-free, they're going to go on to live a long life, and this is only 21 days out of their life. Not a big deal in the big picture, even though it seems like it at the time. Do your best to try to help support this person mentally and emotionally, psychologically, in addition to just the basic medical and nutritional needs. Maybe you can give them, a television and a DVD player and a bunch of movies to watch, or an Xbox and a bunch of video games to play. Maybe you can give them access to the internet. Who knows? You can possibly provide them with something that can help them pass the time, and that would be very wise to do so. Another good strategy is to give them reason for hope. Talk to them about how many days are remaining, and talk to them about what you're going to do after the 21 days. Maybe you'll share a big birthday cake with 21 candles on it to represent each day that they were in isolation. That's what they do at the U.S. Army Research Center. When someone goes in the can, the slammer as they call it, and when they come out, they get a big cake with a candle for every day they were in the slammer. Give them something to look forward to, some kind of celebration at the end of that time. Remember, you have to protect their mental health just as much as their physical health. Now, if you've got more than one family member, you have to really, ideally, set up multiple isolation rooms. I know you didn't want to hear that. It's not wise to just throw people in the same isolation room for a number of reasons, but obviously the biggest one is because one of them might not be sick and the other one might. And then in that case, you may cause the one who wasn't sick to become infected, thereby costing them their life when maybe there was nothing wrong with them. So ideally, you want to have multiple isolation rooms if you're caring for multiple people. This is difficult in homes today unless you've got an 8-bedroom mansion somewhere and a bunch of plastic sheeting. Most of us don't have that, so you'll have to make do as best you can. You can turn one large room into multiple isolation, smaller areas with a lot of plastic sheeting hanging from the ceiling, creating sort of isolation cells within a larger room, but this is a lot more difficult to pull off, and you run a much higher risk of contamination. Difficult to account for airflows. How are you going to get these people fresh air? How are you going to account for the air coming out of these cells, and so on? So, you can't build a hospital overnight, unfortunately, as much as we might even want to. But do the best you can with what you have, and understand that Ebola can contaminate surfaces, and that every person who is suspected of being infected with Ebola needs to be isolated separately as much as possible. Along these lines, by the way, I don't think the federal government will have separate isolation rooms for every person if they start grabbing people and throwing them into quarantine. And this is one of the warnings that I've mentioned about government quarantines, is that they are likely to be death camps because they'll throw maybe 10 healthy people in with 10 people that have Ebola, all in the same room, sharing the same air, sharing the same facilities. And then what do you get at the end of that? You get, 20 people infected with Ebola. And that's an unnecessary cost because 10 of them might have been okay. But does the government have isolation rooms for, 1 million people? No, not at all. They don't even have isolation rooms for a few thousand people. What they have are camps set up, the FEMA camps, the refugee centers, emergency shelters, whatever the case may be. These are set up to be group housing, not to be individual isolation housing units. They're not set up that way. So this is another reason to take every step possible to stay out of the government quarantine centers. Stay home. If you're ordered to stay home, in an isolation order or a medical martial law, national emergency, then stay home. Stay off the streets. The best way to wind up in a quarantine center getting sneezed on by Mr. Ebola is to be caught outside looting the Quickie Mart at 3 in the morning. You know, you're going to pay for that possibly with your life by getting thrown into quarantine. So avoid that. And of course, the best way to avoid that is to prepare in advance so that if there is an isolation order that comes down, you will be able to ride out even many, many weeks in your own home and thereby comply with those isolation mandates, the shelter-in-place orders, and also thereby not run the risk of being arrested or detained or relocated or kidnapped or whatever you want to call it. You know, being taken to a quarantine center at gunpoint. Call it whatever you want, but it's not a safe place to go. All right, so those are the basics. I've really only scratched the surface here. So again, take these principles to heart. Think seriously about the need to build an isolation room or two in your own home. Think about how you would handle an infected family member or a symptomatic family member. Think about the truth that you'll be turned away from the local hospitals and you'll need to take care of this person probably yourself. Also consider the fact that you yourself might become infected or symptomatic and you might need to teach other family members how to care for you using these principles that I've just shared with you here. In many ways, in a sufficiently large outbreak, you will be on your own. And you don't want to have to depend on the government to rescue you because their hands are going to be full. In fact, you actually help create a safer community if you don't become an emergency situation. If you can take care of yourself at home, or if you can take care of a family member at home, and you don't have to end up being in line for emergency food handouts or being in line at a triage tent at the local hospital, then your chances of survival are so much greater, and you'll also reduce your burden on the system. This is a time when there would be zero tolerance for people on the streets or looters or chaos or even public protests. The government will clamp down with a police state response. You can count on it. And they will potentially forcibly vaccinate people. You can potentially count on that too. You want to be able to be as self-reliant and as safe as possible and avoid contact with anybody out in public, even avoid contact with government officials, government checkpoints, government rescue workers, and so on. Stay home, stay safe, stay well-nourished, stay well-hydrated, have a great air filter operating in there, build your clean rooms, live on your stored food supplies, ride this sucker out. You can survive an Ebola outbreak in your city by putting these principles to use. If you want to support our operations, which is funding this entire website and all the downloads and bandwidth, then we do offer long-term storable organic food pails at store.naturalnews.com. We also offer amazing superfoods such as chlorella, spirulina, turmeric, many others. We also offer colloidal silver, even though we don't make any claims about it treating Ebola, of course. But we do offer that for people who want to stock up on that product. So check out store.naturalnews.com if you'd like to support us. I thank you for your support. Even if you don't support us, please share this audio so that others can benefit from this knowledge that the CDC just seems to refuse to tell anybody. It's unbelievable.